Hello and welcome to this episode of the Reset Podcast. I'm your host, Laura Mignot, CEO of the cultural communications agency, The Flash. Each episode, I bring on a different business leader who's doing some game-changing work. And this episode is no different. I am so excited to have Rachana Bhide, who is a leadership psychologist and broadcaster on the show. She is phenomenal. I got to meet her a few years ago, right before COVID.
Yep.
And she has built a phenomenal career that we're going to talk about, especially her learnings in the past 12 months in COVID land. It's going to be a great conversation. Take a listen. Hello. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Laura. Thank you so much for having me.
I'm so psyched to have you. So here we are on a Friday, chatting away. And as the podcast always works, the first question, always the same. So, Rachana, what was your first job?
What was my first job? I don't know any other questions you're asking, but I have been listening to your podcasts for quite a while. So I did know this question was coming. And my first office job, Laura, was as a temp between high school and college. And I primarily was a receptionist and word processor. So I did a lot of 8 hours straight of typing. And a lot of that this was in the late 90s. So at the time, having word processing skills and typing skills, 70, 80, 90 words a minute was an asset. So that was my first job. And it was my first opportunity really to work in an office. And then later on, I went on into university to study workplace psychology. So I do think a lot of that was influenced by some of my early experiences in an office.
Of course, the good old office jobs shape us in ways that we oftentimes don't even realize until we look back on it.
It's so true. Yeah.
And so thinking about that now, what's your career journey from there and that office job to who you are today?
Yeah, well, I really appreciated that I could reflect on that particular first experience because ostensibly it did lead me into this curiosity about workplaces and how people work in teams and how hierarchy works. And so all of those things then are things I studied formally as a psychology major in undergrad and then went on to do as a career, first in change management consulting, where I was working with clients for about 14 years with Accenture, both here in the US and in Europe, looking at some of those exact things about workplace dynamics and primarily helping leaders motivate their teams through change. So ostensibly, like I said, that was really the trajectory that probably the seeds of curiosity were planted during that first job. But even more so, Laura, I was reflecting on my teacher from the class in high school where I learned how to type. It was keyboarding and computer utilization was the name of the class. And I think my mom, I was a freshman in high school and my mom, I think had thought potentially it would be a good way to get me into understanding and appreciating computer science. Interestingly, what it wound up doing was, of course, giving me the skills to take that first kind of temp job in the summer. But also my teacher in that class was probably the most influential teacher in my life for a few reasons. One is she was my homeroom teacher. She was kind of the first teacher I had in this new high school that I was in. And she encouraged me to run for class office my freshman year. And when I was a little bit hesitant and said, I don't know, maybe I'll run for secretary or historian, she specifically said, no, you should run for president. And it was her encouragement. Yeah, truly her encouragement that pushed me to run for an office that I really had never considered. I wound up getting the position, and that actually probably more in a deeper way set me on the trajectory of workplace psychology. But from now, what I'm really able to experience is the impact of a mentor, the positive impact of people who see your strengths and pull them out of you in a way that you might not have thought possible. And then, of course, in high school, being president of my class for 4 years and learning all of those leadership skills gave me this added curiosity for the human side of leadership groups, et cetera. So I think it was really twofold what that job did to influence my trajectory.
Awesome. And so what would you say is like, you had an interesting year. Like I read your LinkedIn post last week, and it was really evocative because it talked about what you found in you and in the city while you were here. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you for reading that. It's interesting too that LinkedIn piece, before the pandemic, I've always been a leadership psychologist. And then before the pandemic, for about 2-3 years prior, I had been adding onto my career as a media host. And I was with Bloomberg, and Bloomberg was an amazing place for me to not just do my profession as a leadership psychologist in-house, but then they also offered me a lot of training and skills and opportunities to host for Bloomberg Live and do interviews. So I say all that because right before the pandemic, I was very used to using LinkedIn as a necessary extension of a public brand. And when the pandemic hit, I went really quiet. And that was a very intentional move on my part. And that's what I shared in that LinkedIn post, which kind of was the first real announcement or public statement I felt that I was making about the year that I had, because I truly wanted the year during the pandemic for myself personally to be, I say unlike any other, but I think that was inevitable for all of us. This year was unlike any other. For me, I was a lot more intentional for myself to go into parts of my personality that I just had let be dormant for a while. So instead of being super extroverted and on public stages that no longer really existed, certainly group gatherings, live events were on hold, I went really introverted, and I spent a year here. I stayed in New York City. Circumstances allowed me to write for pretty much the whole time. I went on long walks in the city, and I got to observe a different side of the humanity that New York City was experiencing in its darkest times in modern history. So I can talk definitely a little bit more about that if there's some specifics, but that just generally was the vibe that I gave for myself. And a lot of that came from being a psychologist, because something happens, and I can be very transparent with you about my age. I'm 41. At the time I was 40 at the start of the pandemic, and something happens. Carl Jung is one of my favorite psychologists, and something actually happens to humans in midlife. And once you cross about 40, and maybe even for some of your listeners that are in their 30s, this is kind of a good heads up, but certainly after you cross 40, you find different parts of yourself. And you do, if you don't want to go into midlife crisis mode, one of the best things you can do is lean into those things. And for me, it was this creative space about writing, and specifically writing about New York City through the eyes of a metaphoric elephant who loves New York City. He embodies a lot of the spirit of what fresh-faced, fresh-eyed people come to New York looking for, which is pursuing a dream, and that spirit of anything being possible, which for me was really positive when New York was, again, going through a really difficult time.
It's interesting you say that, because I don't think you know us, Rachana, but we're the same age. And so
I didn't know that. That's good to know. It's a good cultural reference point too. For what we experienced. Yeah.
Yeah. So similarly, it was very much an interesting transformative year, because last year I turned 40, and I was super excited to turn 40, because I was like, okay, I'm gonna live my best life in 2020. It's gonna be amazing. And all of that blew up in 48 hours. And on top of that, my business blew up in 48 hours because I own an events company. Slight issue. And I've talked about this in the podcast before, that like it was the best blessing for me personally and professionally, because one, I got to fall in love with New York City all over again. And also, I got to discover parts of New York that I didn't know, because like I bought a bike. And so I rode up and down the West Side Highway like at least once or twice a week, and got to see there's a lighthouse in Upper Manhattan. Never knew that was there.
Uh-huh.
Um, and some friendships that I had with friends who you're kind of friends that you would kind of hang out on the weekend with, but they're in the roster of friends versus like they live nearby, so they become your pandemic buddies. And so you're the ones that you kind of go for socially distanced walks with, and get to see from front. Like we went to Governor's Island one Friday afternoon and just like did a picnic, and I'm like, is this really happening? I'm actually picnicking on a Friday. It seems bizarre because it's a work day, right? And I think those things came in really handy, because I think we all went through this insane collective trauma, and that's the first part that folks have to acknowledge, that this was a ridiculously traumatic event. It's still going on. There was no switch that turned everything back to normal. We're still navigating through a very difficult time, and acknowledging that is like the first step in all of this. And I think how you were saying that the things that you experienced really built upon that.
Yeah, you touched on a couple of really important things. And I think the first one is that, as you were sharing how you experienced the pandemic, is that we all had understandable expectations for ourselves to emerge from the pandemic as far better versions of ourselves. And I think we collectively and individually put pressure on ourselves to do that. And one of the things that I'm really being sensitive about with what I produced during the pandemic is to be sensitive to the fact that I was in a situation where I had just left corporate. And yes, for myself, similar to what you shared, it was devastating. It was a devastating hit for my career to not be able to do live events. So it was by no means are the examples that I'm sharing, or certainly you sharing these beautiful examples of reconnecting with people and having picnics and appreciating the outdoors and riding your bike. I mean, I remember following some of the rides you did on social media. So those things are not necessarily to cover up that it was a difficult year, but rather I think they're really great examples of resilience and being able to frame a difficult time with even small enhancements of your quality of life. So I think that was really brilliant the way you shared that. And then the other thing you shared, which is this collective acknowledgement of what we've all been through. And I would even say for myself that I feel like I was able to personally exploit that. And I say that word very dramatically on purpose, because there was no opportunity for any human on this planet to have FOMO for staying in their house. Nothing was going on around the world. Every human,
nothing.
Every human was exactly. Everyone was impacted. And so I think what I really also appreciate about you connecting, even just on our age as just one example, but every one of us was in the exact, for argument's sake, the exact situation that every human on the planet is being affected by this pandemic. And at the same time, the super inward appreciation for each of us as individuals that only each of us as individuals can do, which is the reflection of, wow, well, why, almost like, why me? Why at this time? And for me, it was why at age 40, after I've capped off a 20-year career and I'm just embarking to continue on something, why is this happening to me? And for me, I felt that 40 milestone was actually a bit of a gift. And I know that for other people, they're in very different stages of their lives. Kids had to miss their prom. The Olympics are going on right now. There was a lot of long-term dreams that people held. And I think that in order to navigate through the disappointment, the opportunity for us was to see that the why me wasn't, this isn't only happening to me. This pandemic is happening to everybody, but the why me can be resourcefully addressed to say, well, what can I bring at this stage in my life to this almost once in a lifetime moment?
Yeah. And it was weird because I think, for a lot of, like, I mean, like, I didn't know what I was going to do for work. I mean, wasn't like this is like super duper joyful or any way, shape, or form.
Mm-hmm.
You know, but I do think that it gave us an opportunity to rest,
Mm-hmm.
collectively rest. The sky got to rest, the water got to rest, the grass got to rest. Like, I think,
Mm-hmm. I think I just, you're absolutely right. I mean, even the pollution levels in New York City, I remember sending a picture of the sky to a friend of mine in London. And he said, I've never seen New York City with such little pollution. So you're absolutely right. There was a lot of rejuvenation and healing. And also, again, like one of the things, I'm a leadership psychologist, but I take a lot of my approaches through positive psychology. And one of the things that I try to be very mindful of is not doing what the industry has termed as toxic positivity. So it's not just putting out memes or quotes about how great everything is, but rather almost finding beauty in some of the difficulties and the pain. And that was when I started writing the stories about the elephant. Actually, what wound up happening was I'd used the elephant, his name is Fonty, as a metaphor for emotional intelligence and strength. You know, elephants are huge, but they have very, very sentient mentalities and big memories. So I thought that an elephant was a really great metaphor that I could use in my workplace consulting. What wound up happening was once the pandemic hit, I started walking the city and all of these buildings. And in particular, an important detail is that this elephant came to New York City from South Africa to be a window washer. And he loves buildings. He loves New York City. He loves skyscrapers. And for him, being a window washer is the ultimate dream to contributing to the skyline of New York City in a way that only an elephant can do. And what wound up happening a few weeks later, I picked up this metaphor and the pandemic had just hit and you were here, Laura. So you remember New York City. It was like being on the
oh my God,
first set
I
of
Am
a horror
Legend
movie.
It was
horrible.
It was I Am Legend. It was literally that movie.
Yeah.
Whole Foods was gutted. You could, like, I walked out to Broadway and I saw nothing.
It was eerie. And the worst part was it was like being in the first scene of a horror movie or a difficult movie. You knew that it was going to get more difficult. And over the next couple of months, it did. And for me, I went on, as I mentioned earlier in our chat, I was going on long walks, and soon my long walks started to become a kind of combined projection of myself and also this elephant, because I said, wow, my elephant came to New York City to wash windows, and now all of these skyscrapers are empty. Like, what meaning does that have? And what can we say? What can I say about what, you know, the general conversations that workplace psychologists are having are, do we return to office? And a lot of, you know, when I worked in HR, certainly those were the conversations that I was looking to have, which is how can we make this workplace productive and help people thrive? Now, being on the outside of just those very buildings through the eyes of an elephant who he himself, in my story, his dreams were probably dashed too in a very different way, I think gave me a lot of appreciation also for some of the symbolism in the city. And then and what the symbols of the city mean. And then as I continued to write and added more characters into the story, in particular, one is a mouse named Morris, for all kind of maybe obvious reasons. Their difference in size, their difference in species is a nice message about friendship through diversity. And also as a message and a metaphor of New York City, you know, mice go in through the cracks and they find things in the sidewalks, and they're in different parts of the city. And I'll say somewhat hidden parts of the city, but that's where a lot of the really exciting stuff happens. So those are some other ways that I tried to, through the writing and the metaphors, because again, I use a lot of metaphors as a psychologist, but now looking at metaphors in a way that could help me maybe just appreciate the pain of the city in a new way.
Yeah, I mean, because it was also like, you know, all these like New York is dead, I'm leaving, and all these people make these big pronouncements. It's like, if you want to leave. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I don't need you. Like, that's your personal decision to up and leave. Like, and okay, whatever reason that might be. Like, hey, like I have lots of friends who are like, you know, paying $3,000 a month for a 400 square foot studio isn't really worth it. When I can go stay at my parents' house for free for the next, year. And then when I come back, but I'll come back. I have lots of friends who did that. But all
Yeah.
these people who kind of wrote these like weird ass, like, and a lot of it was from white men, I have to say. And I was like, again, why do we care about your feelings here? Like, let it go. Because remember, there was a guy who wrote that thing, and then like Jerry Seinfeld like dragged him for it.
Yes, about New
and it
York.
was like,
Yes, right.
and so it's just like, what is wrong with y'all? Like, what was the what part of the collective trauma wasn't bad enough for you that you want to like step on people who may not have the privilege to be able to leave because they're an essential worker? They're the delivery guy bringing you each one right before you roll up out of here. So it was just very remarkably tone deaf. But and I saw a lot of those. It's like, I have a friend who left San Francisco. I have a friend who left San Francisco. No one even knows she's gone, and she's moved to another city because she's like, cost of living is cheaper, and like, I want a fresh start. And I'm like, more power to you.
Yeah,
like,
it's really
interesting choices.
Yeah, and it's really interesting because financial reasons. I mean, everyone has a different reason for what in the pandemic, because a lot of those decisions that people made to flee were done in the early stages of the pandemic, and then certainly as time went on and the pandemic still was, New York was still a difficult place to be in the pandemic. As time went on and people's leases expired and things, okay, maybe they made decisions. But in those first weeks during the pandemic, when people truly were fleeing, I found that to be the most interesting statement about the relationship that people had to New York City. And again, many people had reasons for needing more space. Certainly, I'm a single woman. I don't have children. So for me, living in a small contained space in New York City was not the worst thing for myself. But it also allowed me to really, I mean, everyone made a decision. We made a decision to stay. And my decision to stay was primarily because I think it was the first time since moving back from Europe in 7 years. And in spite of, I shared earlier, all the amazing things that I feel like this city has offered my career, it was the first time I could really appreciate what I had set out to come to the city to do, which absolutely is for a career and grad school and all those things. But when I used to watch Sesame Street as a kid in the early 80s, I didn't even know what New York City was, but I understood what New York City was through the characters, through the lessons they were teaching, through the spirit of community and being a good neighbor. And it's not lost on me that now, when it wasn't lost on me during the pandemic, that a lot of the stories that I was creating were somewhat in that vibe of the Muppets and what Jim Henson brought and Sesame Street, especially when Sesame Street came out in the late 60s, like right around 1970, 50 years later, we're in a pandemic. And a lot of conversations about racial justice, a lot of difficult conversations that were happening. Those were the same things that were happening 50 years ago. So I was watching a lot of documentaries about New York City, specifically in the late 60s, early 70s, a lot about the spirit even of Sesame Street and how they designed that show. Because for me, it was my opportunity. And it's almost like the question you asked, what was your first job? For me, it was, what was my first memory of New York City? And it was Sesame Street. And then the excitement that I had as a teenager going from Connecticut down to Virginia on a bus with my mom. And we went through Harlem. And I remember being so excited to see an urban environment because of Sesame Street. So those were the things that I chose to stay in New York City to honor almost the child that would have wanted me to stay in spite of course, the difficult conditions of a pandemic.
And and I think that's part of it. Is that like, it's kind of like, it's weird. Like when I think of my New York experience, I grew up on Long Island in suburbia, and I thought New York City was this far away place when I was a kid. And then when I ended up going to NYU. I remember the first time I came to this campus and I was like, oh wow, this is not anything like I thought it was going to be. And I was like, wow. But then I subsequently was here for 9/11 in college, was here for the financial collapse in 2008, was here for Hurricane Sandy, and now, global pandemic,
Yeah.
epicenter. It's like, could we not anymore?
Yeah. But Laura, thank you for bringing that up. You bring up a really good point because again, my frame of reference is only 7 years. So I came right after Sandy. And while I was accessible and in the US and I was in DC during 9/11, I mean, there have been very, very significant traumatic experiences that the city has come through. And I didn't realize, of course, if you went to NYU and for the same age, you kind of were at NYU during the Friends era as well, which was kind of, and the Sex and the City era. So a lot of hype about New York City. So thank you for also anchoring me and I guess also your listeners back to New York has been through quite a bit. And you, Laura, have been, yeah, and you've been a citizen. You've been a really, really good, loyal neighbor and citizen for it, which is part of why I chose to stay because of people like you. Who make the city their home. And I just didn't want my relationship to the city to be take, because there is a lot that we can give to our neighbors because a lot of our neighbors gave a lot during the pandemic and are giving a lot as essential workers. And of course, a lot of the stories we see about healthcare workers and those heroes.
Yeah, it's a really interesting time to be here, and I'm excited for the future as to where it's going to be. But I think that for a lot of folks who stayed, is this like it reinforced your reasonings for being here.
Yeah.
When I looked at where like my other friends were, I'm like, would I go to LA? No. Would I go to Miami? Hell no. I go to Austin. I like Austin, but I don't know if I could live there. And it's kind of the thing, like I live in Lower Manhattan, so like. This is my home now. Like, and I spent the last 9 years on a plane every other month for my day job. And to actually be home and see how small my apartment really is was a thing. It's like, oh Christ.
Yeah, it's
a big difference. It's a big difference to see it now. And you're like, and why it matters so much to stay.
Yeah. And, you mentioned other cities. And it's funny, when I was writing, as I've been writing Fonty Tales, I've been dabbling a little bit with the actual product. So it's a set of stories and fables, but it could be more. So I've taught myself how to write a screenplay, for example, and
awesome.
That helped me. Yeah, thank you. But I share that because it helped me network, understandably, with a lot of coaches and mentors from Los Angeles, and to understand also the landscape of Fonty Tales is not just for kids, but this particular animated script that I wrote was for kids. And so to even understand the difference in personalities of the cities, and of course, New Yorkers and people from Los Angeles, we always have a little bit of kind of beef with each other, right? But even those decisions that people were making about where to plant roots, I think I look at I'm a psychologist, so it's hard for me not to see personality in objects. And in this case, New York City as the personality of choice for those of us that stayed here. We do put that against cities like Miami, Austin, LA. Those were some of the big ones that also people were going to. And again, I think you also represent the city so much, Laura, by what you've contributed and so much of you being in the media and being a host. I mean, I think of those things as very New York type livelihoods to have. And then, of course, you weighing the decisions and the personality of New York City is what it sounds like kept you here. I love hearing stories like that. And those are the type, that's also, again, I talk about neighbors a lot in Fonty Tales. And that's why I like seeing people who stayed in New York, especially during this time, as neighbors, in addition to previously how I would have seen them as just professional colleagues or just friends. I think this feeling of neighborhoods and neighborly energy that we gave to each other really is something I'm going to take with me.
And I think that's a key part about all of this is that, like, as I said, those relationships change. Like the relationships with my friends who became my pod buddies, totally different. That I would never expect. And again, not that we weren't friends, we just became closer in a different way. And it's because, like, it's sort of this near and far. Like you have your longtime friends who have always been at a different state. So you've always sort of had a group chat, or you've, got on a Zoom call to get a chat. And then you have your friends who you've always kind of had, but like they live in Upper Manhattan. So like you get a little more distance for them because like you weren't going to get Subway. Like, so how would you go see
Yes.
them? And
Right.
so then you have
Right.
proximity of the friends who are here where you're like, well, actually, so I'm going to get to know you a little bit better, like know more about you because like one, you're in my proximity. Two, you're my God.
Yeah.
And if you don't get along, it's going to suck.
Well, it's,
So,
proximity is a huge thing because I didn't leave. I mean, people think I'm crazy, but again, this was somewhat of a social experiment. I'll say it that way. But truly, it was what I felt I needed because, like you, I was always on airplanes, and to be able to plant my roots for 14 months, which is eventually what the duration was. I didn't go anywhere. My feet couldn't take me for 14 months, so I didn't leave Manhattan for the entire pandemic until I got vaccinated, and then the 2 weeks after getting vaccinated. So wherever my feet could take me is where I could meet people. And that to some degree, I think in maybe other neighborhoods or other cities, I would assume that would also be very limiting. I think in Manhattan, it was limiting, of course, because I could only go, the 5 miles that my feet could walk me in any one direction in a day. But also the nice thing about it was that New York is still so diverse, even in, lower Manhattan, middle part of Manhattan. You can still see and access a lot of people's stories, a lot of diversity, a lot of unique experiences. So I was grateful that was my situation. Again, people who had to stay put in different circumstances might not have been able to access maybe the humanity or the different ways that the pandemic was hitting in the way that I feel like I was able to just by physically living in New York during the time.
yeah, it's just it was it's a different sort of it's a different kind of love letter to New York City if you think about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because we're all different now. And one of the things that I came out of this pandemic was like, I love living downtown. I don't think I'll move anytime soon, but oh my God, I need more space.
Yeah. Yeah.
But like, when I was saying, I have like a very specific parameter of where I want to live downtown. And like, I've had a hard time trying to find something. And I've talked to a lot of my friends like, well, Laura, if you would just expand where I'm like, well, no, I lived in this part of the town when there was a pandemic. So you know what that teaches me? That if anything goes wrong, this is the best part of Manhattan to be living in. So
Oh,
no, I'm
right.
not moving. like our
Yeah.
CVS never closed, Joe's Pizza never closed, Dwayne Reed
Mm-hmm.
never closed. Like
Mm-hmm.
I was always
That's
able to get to the grocery store, the Target. Like I'm good.
Laura, that is such an important message, I think, to hear. And also all those people that kept those businesses open and thriving, both as people that were visiting and also, of course, the people that were working there. So you've just described a neighborhood in probably the most appealing way. Again, in spite of it being during the most difficult time, you can very definitively say, look, if another big tragedy happens, this is it. This is the best part of to live in.
Exactly. Do you and I think folks don't realize how the importance of all that, like how key that is. That like, we all have to sort of reinforce ourselves and steel ourselves for like, oh my God, what could happen again? But also, how do you let go and be like, well, actually, I still want to be a bit more YOLO about things because having now lived through a pandemic, I do want to make
Right.
we'll be good to go.
Right, right. Well, I think you have helped me think about one of the things that's been on my mind, which is a lot of the discussions right now are understandably about the most present life choices that are on the table, which really is the return to office for, I'll say, white collar workers. The return to office has been the big discussion. And there is a whole subset of the population that have been working in their offices during this time. The essential workers, healthcare, a lot of people, and in different industries too. Even if they're white collar, they've been maybe in the office. But what you've also brought up, Laura, is that there are a lot of people that are looking at broader impacts of not just the impact of the pandemic, but broader impact that they want to make in the world. And I feel like that spirit of YOLO that you mentioned is something that maybe as we talk about the return to office and when the heck are we done with this pandemic? Because we're not done yet. How can we be thoughtful about that YOLO mentality and not lose the YOLO about it? Because there is a lot of good that people have bottled up in them that they want to put into the world. And so I would hate if we get distracted by it still being the very tactical, tangible next steps, of course, of returning to office, masks. Those are all necessary conversations. But can we allow people to find some YOLO moments that allow them to chase dreams that maybe they lost along the way? That was my story to some extent with being a writer. And once the pandemic ends, and as things are lifting, I am, and we talked about this earlier, that's why I put the article on LinkedIn, like I am myself starting to go back into the world, but I do not want to lose the spirit of what I learned myself this year, which was a lot about, we haven't really talked about elephants and this whole explorative exercise I did on what Fonty Tales would be, and the fact that I didn't flip the book into being a book, and I didn't flip the screenplay into being the thing that I had to put out, but rather I'm still just creating and letting the characters write the story alongside New York as New York is growing and changing. For me, that's been a real dream that I wanted to be able to nurture. I do hope that people will be able to find those YOLO opportunities in spite of a lot of, again, some of the pressing decisions that have to be made about what's next after the pandemic.
Well, I think it's up to us who have a degree of privilege to, one, do what we can to help others, like in a new and impactful way, in a way that makes sense for you. And that could really be, hey, listen, I'm going to set the example of, like, it's really important to rest. Like, and if that goes, and if that's what I can do, then that's what I'm going to do. And the other one, or let me show you how I was able to pivot, or, take a break, or, take on a new challenge. Because I think, when you're in a positions like that, sort of like we are, like I've always sort of been kind of reluctant to be this kind of person, but like the more folks see me, the more they're like, well, Laura, we watch, and I'm like, oh Jesus, and so I'm like, well, then it's kind of my responsibility to sort of be that person who's like, no, honestly, like, dude, this is insane, or stand up for something, or to say something, or to call something out, or to be the example of, like, you can't do this. Like, I think the thing I had yesterday on Instagram, where if you knew me from, like, when I first started my company, our big thing was this hashtag relentless hustle. And, like, we went out all the time. We did all of these back-to-back events. Like, I was everywhere. And in the past year, what actually ended up happening was relentless rest. Kind of forced upon me because I couldn't go anywhere.
Wow.
I told someone recently, the week before my 40th birthday, I was in California. I was on 4 planes in 5 days in 5 different hotels because I was on a business trip. And the idea that I did not get COVID tells me 2 things. 1, God loves me. 2, I'm extremely lucky. And 3, why did I do that? Why? Why did I put myself through that? For what? Yes, those are 2 clients. Did I really need to do that? Like, because whenever I would do the West Coast trip, for example, I would, like, make it a trip to go see some of my friends live in the West Coast. So I would do San Francisco, I'd do LA, I'd, like, run all over creation, go to as many lunches and cocktails and such and blah. And for what?
Yeah. Laura, I know you're the interviewer, but I am learning so much, even just hearing you share that, because when I wrote Fonty at the very beginning, and even right before the pandemic, Fonty he's a metaphor, but he's also, a real character. And so much of what he represented was that hustle culture. And it's very interesting because Fonty comes to New York to be a window washer, and then it becomes him not just wanting to engage with the windows and making them clean for people from the outside, everything he does is a gift of service. So he's making those windows shine in service of the city, in service of the people who are the office workers inside, so they can look outside and see their beautiful city. But then over time, Fonty wants to get to know his neighbors a little bit better. So he becomes a pizza delivery elephant because he knows New Yorkers love pizza. And so there's a whole thing around pizza and him delivering pizzas. And it's very interesting because and then Fonty's also a podcast host. So there's a lot of hustle culture in the original Fonty Tales. And I'm very glad that I didn't just make that the theme of the book, because it's not just a book. This is now a set of his adventures in the city, and he's growing as the city's growing. And that's probably one of the biggest things that I'm seeing as a cultural shift in our society. And even like YouTube influencers are talking about it, is this hustle culture we are really looking at in a very different way. So a year and a half ago, Fonty would have been really admired for being this enterprising, side hustling elephant. And now I don't think that that's really resonant. And to be honest, even for me, and, Fonty reflects a lot about me as a person. I'm also very glad that I was able to pause and let Fonty be what might be a little bit more authentic, which might be a little bit less about just doing side hustles for the sake of doing them, which we all kind of feel pressured sometimes to do, and more just, what's it like just to exist. And certainly over time, as I started researching started researching elephants, and even with Fonty being a pizza delivery elephant, I'm very careful that elephants in the real world should not be giving rides. They should not be lifting things with their trunks. They shouldn't be lifting small children at birthday parties with their trunk, so that's very dangerous for elephants, which a lot of people don't necessarily know. So I also felt, wow, I have a responsibility now that I'm learning about elephants, and that they shouldn't be performing in circuses and giving rides and doing harmful things. How do I place this elephant in the city in a way that does teach good behavior, but without being preachy? So Fonty doesn't ever lift pizzas with his trunk. Originally, I would have thought that, again, after researching elephant behavior and what's natural for them. I don't want that to be the case. So I've built a whole story of inclusion and inclusive design that Fonty's boss, who owns the pizza, Jolly Pizza, Mr. Jolly, he himself learns that elephants shouldn't be lifting things with their trunks. So he works with this scooter company to design a scooter for Fonty that's really safe for him to get around in a way that only an elephant can have, special for him. So it's a message of inclusive design. And I say only special for him because of the size of the scooter, but then down the line, could that be a message of adapting that scooter for other people, and not just animals in this fictitious story, but humans who need and have other abilities? So I think also just being able to explore that, yes, Fonty picked up a side hustle, and that was very much part of the culture pre-pandemic, and maybe it will continue to be, who knows? But actually that side hustle was not about, look, Fonty is an amazing side hustling elephant in New York. It was actually, I could peel back the layers and give myself time to see, actually, that's a real positive opportunity for a message of inclusion. So those are some of the messages that I'm hoping that I can, to your point, as you say, role model. What are some of the things we can share about rest, or what we've learned pivoting, some of the things you shared? Hopefully I can help, Fonty can be a voice also to share some of those lessons, because we have had quite a year too, talking about not just the pandemic, but of course, inclusion, diversity, getting along with each other, working in teams, those types of things too. I hope that we can represent through the stories.
Yeah. And I think those are key elements of it all. It's that we can all continue to learn from each other honestly and openly. So thinking about that, like, what do you think you'd tell the 25-year-old you?
Oh, the 25-year-old me, my gosh. I think I would tell the 25-year-old me to learn German or Spanish or a foreign language sooner. My opportunity to work in Germany when I turned 30 was largely because I went to Germany to brush up on my German, and I lived on a language school for 2 months and then applied to work there. And then that was an amazing chapter of my life. I think being able to access foreign languages as early as possible is amazing, just because it gives you, of course, the opportunity to physically work in another country, but also at 25, I think I would tell myself, even knowing another language gives you access to poetry and music and a way of thought that you would never, ever otherwise be able to have access to if you don't know that language. So that would be probably the most tactical thing I would tell myself at 25. Beyond that, I think, like most 25-year-olds, it's really hard to predict or to understand what a 40-year-old is telling you, because you are in a different frame of mind. And so to that end, I think I would say what Carl Jung, again, my favorite psychologist, would have said, and what I tell my fellow kind of 40-year-olds, is that your first half of your life really is to accumulate resources, and it's knowledge, wisdom, friends, spouse, money, skills. And then when you hit 40, it becomes about finding purpose and finding meaning. And so I would say to myself, so the same way I tell the 40-plus-year-old folks that I do, and I say folks because they're leaders, they're employees, they're stay-at-home moms and dads, regardless, I tell a lot of my 40-plus coachees that whatever crises or shift or desire that you're feeling to find more meaning and purpose in your life, that's exactly where you're supposed to be right now. We can productively work to find a way to help you find that purpose. But I would then, to that point, say to the 25-year-old me, keep doing what you're doing, and just maybe know that when you face crises, it's going to be a combination of a world crisis that everyone's going through. So your challenge is going to be, what resources have you created for yourself, not just money, not just your career, but inside, that you can then reach back into when you need them. So I would just maybe continue to tell my 25-year-old self, just be aware, and probably continue to keep a journal as well.
Yeah, I think it's key. I think that's all awesome and really great stuff. Now, question for you. What do you do for your self-care? Having done all of this and looked at all this.
Yeah, it's really self-care. I don't have an answer for that, because I only have the pre-pandemic answer and the pandemic answer. And both of those were quite bingy in response. So pre-pandemic self-care was work. And then if you need to sleep, your body will tell you, and then just sleep as long as you need to, which usually was on the weekends. So that was a very bingy cycle where I just assumed self-care was, my body will tell me when I need to rest, and then I will just do that. During the pandemic, I have felt that the whole year has been self-care. And that's also a bit of a bingy extreme example, because not everybody was able to unplug, I think, in the way that I was able to unplug for myself. But also, I haven't yet done self-care, Laura, in the post-pandemic world. So I would say the types of things I do that bring me a lot of joy that I've rediscovered during the pandemic, certainly it's Fonty and writing and going on long walks, and making the walks not just for me, but also for my imagination, and entertaining my imagination and seeing things in a different way, that somewhat you do get a bit limited in exploring that creative side when you are working 75, 80 hours a week. You don't really get that time. So that's something I'd like to continue being able to do. And also music for me has been a real rediscovery. Prior to the pandemic, music was always kind of a background soundtrack to wherever I was going on the subway or on planes. And so I have a whole set of memories that are associated with those songs. Now being able to see music and almost appreciate the artist and try to understand what the artist was feeling. That was something I never really wanted to access or understood how to access, but somewhat now being a bit of a creator myself, that's how I'm listening to music now. And it's really, really good for the soul for me, because it helps me feel really connected to art, and also to, I would say, a whole demographic of people who have created things for this world that I've been enjoying for so many years, whether it's music or art, or screenplays. Being able to understand how they think and what joy or pain it brings them to share their stories, that's been also really healing for me.
Awesome and necessary. And because I think, music fuels the soul. I mean, like, there's all these different studies that show that, like, when you listen to music, it absolutely begins to heal you.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter what it is, like whatever music it is. And so I would definitely agree. Like, it's funny, like I listen to podcasts on my way up when I ride my bike, and I listen to music all my way down whenever I ride my bike back
Oh,
home.
no kidding.
Like it's definitely, I guess I think I want to like go faster or just get a little bit more amped up. And so it works for me to do that. So yeah, I'm totally with you on that.
Oh, what a mindful, like thoughtful ritual. I mean, that's such a great example of self-care, which is obviously the question you posed. And then just, it's resonating with me as just a great ritual that, allows you to almost exercise different parts of yourself as well, even though you're ostensibly doing the exact same thing, which is riding a bike in two different directions or at two different times of day. I think that's brilliant.
Why, thank you. I mean, we could just keep on chatting forever. But I now have my last question for you. Do you have a give and or an ask of the audience?
Oh my gosh. It would be to to not ride elephants. Like that's it. Just to see animals, and wild animals in particular, as their own individual beings. They're not for us as humans to capture and put into zoos and put into circuses or to give us rides. There are exceptions, of course, with respect to different cultures and how they need and leverage animals for food and for transportation. That's not really what I'm saying. This is more for probably most of your listeners. Please don't take that elephant safari ride. Yeah. And safaris are good. And there's really ethical safaris where you just literally, and actually it's amazing you use the word safari and you use that as an example, because safaris are good ways, as long as you don't get too close to the animals to disrupt them, to be able to watch the animals from a distance, and just let them exist and just let them be. And, so, it's interesting because my original ask would have been, and maybe by me saying this is kind of a sneaky way to sneak it in, which would be, oh, please follow Fonty Tales and, understand, how you can use metaphors in your own life. And that's all kind of the stuff that I, Rachana, bring as a leadership psychologist. But I tell you, when we talk about purpose and we talk about what the one desire is that we have for the world, for me, it really is for humans to find joy in connecting with animals, particularly wild animals, in a way that appreciates them. Because I feel like when we do that, we also feel a very different connection to the world. So even by just making a choice not to take a dream tourist vacation in Asia riding elephants, because it's really harmful to elephants to do that, to just even make a decision not to do that, that ethical decision actually, it reverberates in your soul, to whatever degree you want it to. If you're super mindful of it, it'll make you feel even better. If not, then you might just make a decision and move on. But I really, if I could impress upon people, it is to just be really, really mindful of this experiences you have. And please don't ride elephants.
Just don't do it. Just don't do it.
And I say this
also, just not?
Because me, myself, again, like before I even researched elephants, I didn't know that. And if I had just put this book out about Fonty coming to New York City to be a window washer, and then he gets interviewed by the local news, and then he's a pizza deliverer, I would have put Fonty in and depicted him as an elephant in situations that would have been dangerous. And so again, only because I was able to take time and research and then myself feel this really deep connection to my purpose, which is is about writing about New York City and writing about emotional intelligence and leadership psychology through the lessons of this elephant. But if all of that goes away, and if the Instagram and my books and no one ever buys any of it, it doesn't matter, because for me, the message of connectedness and ultimately hopefully raising money to support elephants, I think that's something that really helps us all as humans as well.
That's an amazing message, and you're just amazing.
Thank you, and thank you for letting me ask, and thank you for letting me make that share and that ask, because I don't think this is not really a corporate podcast that you have, but a lot of times I feel like I don't get the opportunity to say that. So thank you for giving me the space to say that and ask that of people that are listening.
Awesome. And I think, it's just necessary, straight up, just necessary to do it. So I'm happy to provide you space to do that.
Thank you.
It's been such a delight to have you on the show. Like I said, we could keep on chatting for quite some time.
I know.
We'll put all the details in the show notes so folks can follow Fonty Tales and follow what you're doing. And also just kind of remember the importance of, falling back in love in the city, wherever it might be.
Yes, totally.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us. And that is our show.